Well, we have about 45 minutes left in the Washington Journal. We're going to turn our attention to U.S. policy in Iraq. Support, oppose are going to be the phone lines, but our guest is going to be Eason Jordon, who is the founder of Iraqslogger.com. We'll be right back.
Middle and high school students, get your entries ready for C-SPAN's 2007 Student Cam National Video Competition. Pick a current political topic of interest to you, and using some C-SPAN video, produce a video documentary of 10 minutes or less. The grand prize winner will receive $3,000, and 45 prizes will be awarded overall, with the top entries airing on the C-SPAN networks. To learn more and for entry forms, go to studentcam.org. Entries must be received no later than March 30th. C-SPAN's 2007 Student Cam National Video Competition. What political issue matters to you? Monday night on The Communicators, former head of the Cable Telecommunications Association, Steve F. Ross.
Writing regulations and policy for fast-moving telecommunications industries is bound to fail. I mean, it's bound to be behind the curve. It always is. And I think that the same is true in cable television.
Steve F. Ross, Monday night at 8 Eastern on The Communicators on C-SPAN 2.
Washington Journal continues.
Well, now joining us from Atlanta is Eason Jordon. He is the founder of Iraqslogger.com. We want to show you that website if you didn't get a chance to look at it. And he's the former chief of news executive of CNN. Mr. Jordon, what is Iraqslogger.com?
Good morning, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be with you this morning. Iraqslogger.com is a news and blog site dedicated to all things Iraq. And it grew out of the fact that it seemed there were a million places on the internet to get information about Iraq, but there was not one place on the internet to get information on Iraq. And so we wanted to bring it all together. New media, old media, hard news journalism, blogging, diary entries from people in Iraq, critiques of existing media reporting, bring it all together for a one-stop source for people in the United States and around the world to be up to date on Iraq and to know a variety of perspectives on Iraq.
And why did you choose to do this?
Because we felt that news consumers deserve better than they were getting. I mean, certainly there are a lot of courageous journalists in Iraq putting their lives on the line to bring us news, information about that country. But there was not one place to go for information about Iraq. There were just too many places, too much information, but we wanted to bring it together in a way that made sense to news consumers, allowed them to go to one place to get all the information they might want or need, and we feel that the one-stop shopping is a great benefit to news consumers in this country and around the world.
When did you start it, and what's your personal involvement today?
Well, we started, it's just barely a month old, I think maybe 6 weeks old now. We launched just before Christmas, and we've had great success with it. We've had 1.5 million page views, around 200,000 visitors to the site. It's growing rapidly, and it's really gotten a great buzz, especially in the Iraq-focused community. There was one member of the Iraq study group of the Baker-Hamilton Commission who wrote to me and said that he goes to sleep now 2 hours earlier at night because we spare him the trouble of having to go to 100 different websites to pull together everything he needed to know on Iraq. And so we're young, we're growing, we have a great team of people, my co-founder Robert Pelton, a handful of people here in the United States, and around 50 people actually in Iraq, Iraqi nationals who are helping us pull all the information together.
Is this an expensive venture?
Well, it's not cheap. It's something being funded out of my pocket. We have some investors as well in this country and overseas who believe in what we're doing. And it's the first step in a series of businesses we're launching that are focused on Iraq and other hotspots around the world that are essentially meant to enlighten people, enabling them to make smarter judgments about policy issues, and in some cases for people in the region, in Iraq, to make smarter judgments about where they go and what they do with the goal of saving lives.
Now, Eason Jordon, you've been to Iraq several times. How many times, and when was the last time?
It's been about a year since I was last there. I've been 16 times, 13 times during the Saddam Hussein regime, 3 times since. I've gone on unilateral missions, meaning not embedded with U.S. forces. I've also been embedded with U.S. forces, including with General Dave Petraeus, who is going in as the top U.S. general in Iraq here in the next few days. But every time I've gone since the U.S. move into Iraq, the situation has clearly been worse than previous times in, and unfortunately now, clearly it's a tragic situation with just horrendous loss of life.
Now we're going to begin taking calls. We're going to get a lot of calls with a lot of viewpoints, strong views on both sides. Do you have a point of view on the war?
Point of view number one is it's a tragedy for all involved. Point of view number two would be the Iraqi people. I think the vast majority of them are glad to be rid of Saddam Hussein, and certainly I'm glad to be rid of Saddam Hussein because I saw firsthand how evil his regime was. Having said that, it's been a disastrous few years in Iraq, and at least in the Baghdad area and in other parts around Baghdad, and you know, more needs to be done to try to bring peace and tranquility to that country. And God knows the Iraqi people have suffered enough, and the American people, the soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors have paid a heavy price over there as well. It's been very expensive in lives lost and in taxpayer dollars. And you know, hopefully General Petraeus and this new plan can make things somewhat better over there, but I think it'll be a long haul. It's going to be very difficult. The name of our site, Iraqslogger, comes from Donald Rumsfeld, who referred to the fight in Iraq as a long, hard slog. And agree or disagree with Donald Rumsfeld, love him or hate him, he's absolutely right about it being a slog and a very painful one.
Does Iraqslogger.com have a point of view or an editorial page?
There is no Iraqslogger editorial page per se. I mean, we have a lot of perspectives that are contributed to our site. I think it's fair to say that certainly Iraqslogger knows the pain, feels the pain of the Iraqi people, the American people, and all of us who are slogging through this effort. But Iraqslogger does not take a point of view as far as for or against the war. Certainly we're all for peace and for tranquility for the Iraqi people and for eventually, you know, the U.S. Getting out of there when it makes sense, but now arguably is not that time.
Mr. Jordon, on your website, which we have up right now, on the left-hand column there are all sorts of categories, and as I've gone through it, I've noticed Baghdad Diary I wanted to ask you about. You also have Iraqi deaths, U.S. deaths, but you also have a category called, well, you've also got some bloggers, but you have a category called Good News I wanted to mention.
Right. Well, there is good news in Iraq, and there are a lot of people in this country who feel that the news media don't do a fair job, an adequate job of reporting the positive things that are happening. But there's an entry on the site, on the homepage today, a good news entry that's about coalition forces rescuing hostages and arresting some so-called terrorists who had taken these people hostage. And I think good news stories deserve attention. And one of the great things about new media versus old media is we're not confined to 22 minutes. We have a website that has unlimited capacity, and we certainly can provide good news stories as we learn of them and put them on the site.
And I did not see any ads.
Well, there are a few ads there for some of our related businesses. There's a parent company of Iraqslogger called Predict. Predict is launching a company called Iraq Safety Net. That'll be coming in the next few weeks. That will be a 24/7 news service, a subscription service dedicated to safety information in Iraq and information for people on the ground to enable them to make smarter judgments about where they go and what they do, and hopefully saving some lives in the process. But there will be some advertising. It's not a big money venture by any means. We certainly expect our other companies to be the money drivers of the parent company.
Eason Jordon is the founder of Iraqslogger.com, previously chief news executive for CNN. How long were you with CNN and when did you leave?
Peter, I was there 23 years. I spent most of my life with CNN. I started as a $3.25 minimum wage worker. I worked on the overnight shift for 6 years and eventually in 1989 took on oversight of all international news coverage at age 28. And grew up at CNN, was the head of news coverage, was the chief news executive, and then I left 2 years ago in a bit of a controversy. I had made some remarks in Davos, Switzerland at a World Economic Forum, which actually is going on today, 2 years later. It's an annual event. There was a discussion about journalists being killed in Iraq. I made a reference to journalists being killed by U.S. forces. There have been roughly 15 or 18 journalists killed by U.S. forces, and I expressed my dismay about that and used a phrase I shouldn't have used, targeting, because I was alarmed that U.S. military forces had killed as many journalists as they had, and they had fired at them directly, not knowing they were journalists. These were mistakes. But they had fired thinking they were firing at enemy forces when in fact they were firing at journalists in a number of these cases, and they hit them, firing upon them directly, and just tragic, tragic mistakes. I wasn't as clear as I should have been at the time, turned into a big fuss, and in the end I chose to leave CNN to spare CNN the controversy, and I went off and decided to go my own way, and here we are now with Iraqslogger.
And finally, before we go to calls, in 2003, though, you also wrote a very widely read op-ed in the New York Times, "The News We Kept to Ourselves." What was this about, sir, and why did you write it?
Well, in 2003, I wrote that op-ed. It was after the U.S. Move into Iraq had occurred. It was after it was clear that Saddam Hussein's regime was finished. Saddam Hussein was on the run. And there were a few stories I felt that needed to be told that could not be told until that point. At least that was my take on things. You know, CNN had a long history in Iraq. CNN was thrown out of Iraq more than any other news organization. CNN staff, including myself, were banned from Iraq more than the journalists of any news organization. So we had a long, rough history with the Saddam Hussein regime, and which in fact accused me of being at one point the CIA Baghdad station chief, which of course was ludicrous. But the op-ed I wrote in the New York Times in 2003 told stories of a few isolated cases that I felt could not be told to that point about some human rights abuses, brutalities perpetrated by the Saddam Hussein regime, that I felt if they were told with that level of specificity, where it was clear who precisely we were talking about, that innocent people would be killed. And I don't know of anyone who would tell a story that they knew would result in the deaths of innocents. And so there were a handful of stories that I chose not to report, while at the same time ensuring that CNN did report on the brutality of the Saddam Hussein regime, to the point that CNN was banned repeatedly by that Iraqi government, and in fact was not even in Baghdad for the bulk of the war in 2003 until U.S. forces arrived in Baghdad.
U.S. policy in Iraq is our topic. By the way, our international line is open if you're watching or living outside the U.S. 202-628-0184 is the number for you to dial. journal@cspan.org is our email address. First call up for Eason Jordon comes from Dayton, Ohio. Go ahead, Dayton.
Good morning. Yes, my question is this. I'm wondering about the relationship Iraq has with its neighbors. I know the report that was just released, the Hamilton report just released recently, suggested, I guess, we talk to the neighbors of Iraq. I can understand, I guess, maybe Iran and Syria, but I'm wondering, why don't we have other forces or troops from other countries around there in Iraq helping us?
Mr. Jordon.
Well, the answer to that would be, first of all, Iraq has a much better relationship with Iran than Syria than does the United States. The Iraqi government is a government that has leaders now who have long histories with those two neighboring countries, Iran and Syria. The president of Iraq, Jalal Talabani, spent a lot of time in Syria during the Saddam Hussein era, and Prime Minister Maliki spent a fair amount of time in Iran, as did a lot of the Shia leadership in Iraq now during the Saddam Hussein era. So there's a long history there. Having said that, no doubt, to varying degrees, the Iranian and Syrian governments are responsible for some of the trouble in Iraq today. As far as why no neighboring countries, and I should point out there are many neighboring countries, not just those two, that why have they not contributed forces within Iraq? The Syrians, the Iranians, the Turks, the Jordanians, and the Saudis just don't see it as in their interest. Most of those governments oppose the war to begin with, and they feel that there's not a place for their forces within Iraq itself.
Charlotte, North Carolina, go ahead.
Yes, I'm the mother of a United States Army soldier getting ready to go over with this new surge. And I think I'm more upset and worried about my son's well-being more because of our Congress than frankly, the Iraqis. My question really is, didn't we learn anything from Vietnam, that we fight a war to win? And, President Bush told us after 9/11 how difficult this war was going to be to win. I mean, every single thing that he said, if we played a tape of it, we'd be able to see it all has come to pass. Yes, there were possibly no weapons of mass destruction that have been found within Iraq itself. However, the world community obviously knew that they were there. And Islamofascism has been opposing the United States for 30 years. And in light of what we know of what's happening in Iran and Syria and their involvement in all of this, I just wanted to ask you a question. When you think the press and the Congress is going to be more invested in our winning this war?
Mr. Jordan.
Well, I think the press and the Congress are certainly invested in the war, but there's obviously a huge controversy in this country about whether or not it's prudent to proceed with the war, at least in the fashion in which we're proceeding today. The vast majority of the American people have made it emphatically clear they want to see the U.S. start to exit Iraq. Coincidentally, the Prime Minister of Iraq, Mr. Maliki, has made it emphatically clear that he wants to see U.S. forces start to exit the country at least by the end of the year. He said just a couple of days ago when he met Nancy Pelosi in Baghdad that he wanted to see 50,000 U.S. troops leave Iraq by the end of 2007. Now we'll see whether or not that's feasible. As far as whether or not the U.S. is fighting to win, there's no question that President Bush is taking that tack. But I think a lot of important, very legitimate questions are being raised in Congress about this war and about how we should proceed with this war. And I know that everybody has, I think, the interest of the United States at heart when they talk about how to go forward there, but there are very important, legitimate questions about how this war is being executed, and without a doubt, hundreds, if not thousands, of mistakes have been made by the United States in this conflict to date.
On Iraqslogger.com, Amir Mohsen has an article about Muqtada al-Sadr, saying that he supports the new plan for security. Is this a support of the U.S. surge by Muqtada al-Sadr?
Well, that's certainly what the Sadr Current, which is his group, essentially has to say right now. Sadr goes back and forth across the line. At times he's somewhat of a U.S. ally, at other times he's a U.S. enemy. A recent U.S. military report on Iraq branded the Sadr group the #1 threat to stability in Iraq, and I think there's a lot of speculation now about how Sadr and his Mahdi organization will deal with this so-called surge, with some people saying, well, they'll take on U.S. forces if U.S. forces go into certain neighborhoods of Baghdad, and other people saying, well, the Mahdi army will just melt away and let the U.S. come and go, and then the sectarian rift in Baghdad will come to the fore again. And so, I mean, if Sadr is going to play ball and be a positive, constructive force, that's a good thing. But there's plenty of evidence that in the past he has not taken that stance.
You know, I haven't seen any mention of Ayatollah al-Sistani recently.
Well, Sistani's out there in a big way, but he is not as political a presence as Sadr and Hakim and others. Sistani is a spiritual leader in a sense, and certainly when the Iraqi government or others are seeking blessings for certain policy changes, for example, then they'll go to Sistani and seek that blessing. But Sistani is not an active political force in the sense that he does not have an active political bloc of his own. He really spans the Shia spectrum in Iraq and is the senior Shia leader for that country.
Detroit, you're on with Eason Jordon. Go ahead.
Good morning. Mr. Jordan, I have two quick questions and one quick comment. The first question is, according to our military intelligence, 65% of the foreign fighters in Anbar province are directly out of Saudi Arabia. Is that true? Second question is, according to a report on Keith Overman, that the Pentagon is hard-pressed to come up with any evidence that Iran is infiltrating into Iraq and killing our troops. And my quick comment is, if I was the president, I would call my friend Prince Bandar and tell him if I caught one more Saudi jihadi killing our troops in Anbar province, that I would start leveling the oil fields. Good day.
Well, thanks, sir. First of all, Saudi Arabia obviously can't control all of its people. If it could, we wouldn't have had 9/11 because so many of the terrorists who carried out the 9/11 attacks were Saudi citizens, and I don't think there's any doubt that the Saudi government supported that or condoned that in any way. There are some people in Saudi Arabia who hate the United States and who are jihadists and who are at war with the Saudi government in that sense. So it's not just that they have hatred for the United States and want to kill Americans, they even want to kill the Saudi leadership, and so that's a challenge for the Saudi government as well as for U.S. military forces in Iraq. I don't know the 65% number. That number may or may not be right. No, undoubtedly, there are Saudis fighting in Anbar and perhaps elsewhere within Iraq, and you also have foreign fighters coming in from Syria and to a lesser degree Jordan. So the foreign fighters are a big factor, but let's be clear about one thing. The vast majority of violence in Iraq today is Iraqi on Iraqi violence. It's not violence that involves foreign fighters. It's not violence that involves coalition forces, American forces. We believe the Baker Commission report put forth a number of over 1,000 attacks a day in Iraq that take place, with a very small fraction of that actually being noted or reported by the U.S. military or by the Western news media. And so there's horrific violence happening every day in Iraq, and the vast, vast majority of it is Iraqi violence on other Iraqis.
Ottawa, Canada. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for taking my call. Mr. Eason, what is victory in Iraq? They have never defined what victory is. Is it victory means that we have an Iraqi government that is pro-business, pro-Western, compliant, so that they can give us all the oil without any nationalistic ideas, sentiments? Surely the Iraqis will want to control the wealth. What is victory?
Eason Jordon.
Well, I think defining victory is tough, because victory 3 or 4 years ago, I think, would be defined differently from what victory would be defined as today. I think the U.S. government would feel it was victorious if there was a stable government in Iraq. It was a good standing member in the international community. That's very different from the way victory would have been defined 3 or 4 years ago by the U.S. government. At that time, and even a year or two later, victory from a U.S. government standpoint would be for the Iraqi government essentially to stand as some sort of shining light of democracy in the Middle East, and perhaps the first in a domino effect of democracy sweeping across the region. I think now the U.S. leadership would be happy to settle for something far less than that, just stability, tranquility, and to have an Iraqi government that was in good standing in the international community.
Mr. Jordon, do you know what kind of coverage the anti-war rally here in D.C. got in Baghdad yesterday?
Well, it certainly did get coverage, but I don't know precisely just yet to what degree. You know, one of the things we have on Iraqslogger is a daily roundup of what's in Iraqi newspapers. And if I read the newspaper roundup correctly, the papers didn't give a huge amount of coverage today to the rally, but given the time difference, I think we could see significantly more coverage in the days ahead. And one thing I think that you have to be mindful of with the Iraqi newspapers is, of course, they're focused mostly on events in their country. And every day there are tragedies and horrors in their country. But there's no doubt that the Iraqi press takes note of the infighting back in Washington on the political level, and has taken note of the fact that there large number of American people is demonstrated through polling as well as public demonstrations who are opposed to the U.S. military presence in Iraq.
You said you have about 50 people over in Iraq. Do you have an office, or is this all done by a home computer?
It's all electronic. It's a virtual world, so to speak, in a news gathering sense, and I think that's one of the exciting things about what we're doing. This is new media. This is a new generation of news coverage in the sense that we have traditional gumshoe news reporting, journalism going on, combining that with blog reports from Iraqis, from Americans. We even have diary entries from people who are not journalists at all, who simply tell us their stories of life and death in Iraq, and I think those stories are extremely illuminating. We had a story yesterday about a Saddam Hussein-era government official whose wife, whose children, whose grandkids had all been killed since the U.S. move into Iraq, and now he's literally a beggar on the streets. And I think these kinds of stories are illuminating and go beyond what you might find in traditional reporting.
Macon, Georgia, you're on with Eason Jordon. Go ahead.
Yes, just a moment ago you actually preluded to the reason I'm calling when you mentioned the Iraqi violence on, Iraqi on Iraqi. I guess the fundamental question in my mind is, can Shia and Sunni get along, let alone work together to achieve, a stable government in Iraq? Should the Iraqi military get up to speed to where we can actually stand down? Does that make sense? And what could any long-term prognosis be, knowing that the military is made up of the Shia and the Sunni? And do they want to get along and coexist and move forward with their government?
Well, what they can do and what they will do may very well be two different things. I mean, right now they're definitely two different things. Certainly there are elements in the Sunni and Shia communities that want nothing but peace and are prepared to work together to achieve that goal. There are other elements within those communities that are full of hatred, are committed to violence, and there are a lot of revenge attacks, for example. And it's not just Sunni, Shia. There are tribal issues, there are family issues, and there's an enormous amount of bloodletting going on right now. And there have been plans floated, for example, outside of Iraq by Senator Biden, for example, that would call for essentially dividing the sects and the ethnic groups in Iraq and essentially de facto partitioning of the country, similar to what you have in the former Yugoslavia. And it may well come to that. It may be that you just have to break everybody up into their own little groups to stop this level of bloodshed, or at least to cut it down significantly. That may well have to happen because there is just an enormous amount of killing going on right now in Iraq, and there's no real sign of that abating. We can only hope and pray that the U.S. move in Baghdad will actually make a big difference.
Wales, United Kingdom, go ahead.
Hello there, Mr. Jordan. How are you?
Well, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, one of the things I think needs to be looked at in relation to Iraq and U.S. policy to make it an historic, especially for the future, historically a good thing for all of humanity, is the fact that there is something which has been glossed over by the media, which is the U.S. petrodollar exchange mechanism came under threat in 2001 when Saddam Hussein started selling oil, which he was allowed to sell into the Oil for Food program, in euros rather than US dollars. And I just think that to get legitimacy, that needs to be investigated, because otherwise we're going to end up, people are going to be saying, well, was the invasion about weapons of mass destruction when none were found, or was it about saving the U.S. economy?
Right. Well, the oil sector in Iraq's a real mess. There's been a lot of investigating of the oil sector from Saddam's time. The oil sector since Saddam's time has been a real mess as well, and a lot of corruption, a lot of bad stuff going on there. But there's always going to be speculation that the war was about more than just weapons of mass destruction and getting rid of Saddam Hussein. But I don't know that the oil was necessarily the driving force behind the war itself.
Is Ahmed Chalabi still in charge of the oil?
Ahmed Chalabi is not so much in charge of oil, to my knowledge. You know, his group had a disastrous showing in the parliamentary elections several months ago, but he still is a force within Iraq, mostly in the issue of de-Baathification. He has played a big role in that, and he has had for a time some role in the oil sector, but the oil minister is not Chalabi himself, and as far as I know, Chalabi has no oversight of the oil sector.
And Mr. Chalabi is now, aren't they trying to bring back the Baathists that were kicked out earlier? Isn't he part of that group?
Well, Ahmed Chalabi is big time opposed to Baathist being brought back into the government, at least in meaningful, significant ways. At least that's my understanding. He led the de-Baathification effort and was a big factor in the U.S. Coming forward with that de-Baathification campaign back in 2003. There is now an effort by the Prime Minister of Iraq to invite back into the government, principally into the military, Baathist officials from the Saddam Hussein era up to a point. I mean, obviously they don't want any senior officials from the Saddam Hussein era coming back in, but Chalabi, for the most part, he's given a little bit in recent weeks and months, but for the most part has been a leading advocate against having Baathists back in the government.
We are talking with Eason Jordon, who is the founder of Iraqslogger.com. He spent 23 years at CNN, finally serving as chief news executive at that network. Dallas, Texas, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Jordan.
Morning.
Yeah, I have 3 quick points. First of all, I'd like to recognize that you are one more victim of media complicity with the war, which has gone from about 40% against to 60% as public opinion has changed. I honestly think you're in a position to know something about why CNN has become so sensationalistic and deliberately, irresponsibly provocative. Your thought on that? And one more. Our children will record this period of time, and what they'll see immediately is propaganda creates a struggle for credibility. And I think that you're uniquely qualified to comment on this. Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood all the questions, but let me address the CNN issue. CNN's in a very competitive environment. CNN is still my favorite news network and favorite news organization among the TV networks, at least. I think CNN does a terrific, phenomenal job, and I'm very proud of my colleagues there. Having said that, they're in an enormous competitive challenge. Fox News, MSNBC, and many other competitors out there, because it's not just confined to the TV space. Of course, you have the internet, radio, and other outlets as well. And there's no question that there is a real challenge when it comes to generating and retaining viewership and news consumers for CNN and for all of the CNN properties. And I think they're doing the best they can in very challenging circumstances. There are times when it's very, very provocative and compelling, and times perhaps even sensationalistic. But CNN's not alone in that regard, and I have to applaud CNN because I think on the whole they do a much better job than their competitors.
On Iraqslogger.com, one of your primary stories right now is the CBS issue. What happened there?
Well, fascinating story. One of the things we do is watch the media, and we do a daily roundup of American newspaper reporting on Iraq, for example. It's not just a summary, but a critique of reporting, and we also look at other news outlets and how they're reporting on Iraq and any fusses that might be created in that regard. And the controversy of the moment is that a CBS correspondent, in fact the chief foreign correspondent of CBS News, Lara Logan, did a report on the fight on Haifa Street. Haifa Street is a central street in Baghdad, very close to the Green Zone, where there's been very, very intense fighting with U.S. forces, Iraqi forces, insurgent forces, and maybe some foreign fighters as well. And that fighting has gone on and off for the past couple of weeks. Lara Logan whose CBS bureau is actually on Haifa Street, amazingly, filed a report back to CBS News in New York for Katie Couric's CBS Evening News program. It was a report that contained some graphic images on a day that was a very busy day, Iraq News Day. And the CBS Evening News, whose managing editor is Katie Couric, the CBS Evening News decided not to broadcast the particular story. And Lara Logan, who's a very passionate journalist, at that point very upset that her report had not been broadcast on the evening news program, apparently because it contained some graphic images. Lara Logan sent an email to CBS News colleagues and to friends asking for their help in convincing CBS management to put her report on the air. She failed in that regard, but it became a public story because her actual email became part of the public debate. And you can find that email on Iraqslogger.com. To CBS's credit, even though the report did not air on the CBS Evening News, it is posted in full on the CBS News website, and you can also find that report linked through Iraqslogger.com.
About 10 minutes left. Rock Island, Quebec. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. I'm really following up the last caller when he mentioned propaganda, because I really think that is what needs to be investigated, and I'm very interested in your website and wondering how much investigation do you do? Because when the previous caller, made an excellent point about propaganda and the media complicity in this entire escapade, all the way from the beginning of weapons of mass destruction, that's the major lie, all the way to the Jessica Lynch, the football player Tillman story. The media was right in there lying. Right, where was the investigation? And just
Eason Jordon.
Well, first, certainly it's important that the news media get to the bottom of certain stories, and there are times when initial information is incorrect, not because anyone's lying, just because you know, there's a lot of fog on the battlefield, fog of war. Reporting where a lot of information, the initial reporting is not accurate. That's information that comes from officials as well as from eyewitnesses on the ground. So getting to the ground truth is vitally important, and Iraqslogger has many missions. One is very much to get to the ground truth, cut through the spin, and tell the facts as we can determine them. There's one particular example I'd want to cite, and that is the number of attacks every day in Iraq. Now, the U.S. military puts out regular reports on the number of attacks in Iraq, and those attacks have risen on average from less than 100 to over 100, now I think roughly 170 a day. Now, what is a fact is that the number of actual attacks beyond the reported numbers are many multiples of that, 5, sometimes 10 times that number within Iraq. And the reality is the U.S. military cannot and does not track all the attacks. Most of the attacks do not involve U.S. forces and do not involve foreign fighters, and there's just no means to track all of these things. But we at Iraqslogger have pointed out repeatedly that the U.S. military puts out incorrect counts that aren't even remotely accurate, and the news media parrot them without even questioning this, and this has to be addressed, and a more accurate accounting system must be put into place. When you go back to weapons of mass destruction, you know, I don't know that it was so much lies as simply people believing what they wanted to believe in some cases, and that without a doubt, I mean, Saddam Hussein's regime at one point had weapons of mass destruction and used them on the Iraqi people and on a neighboring country, Iran. And so I think we have to be careful. You know, things are not black and white. These are very complex issues. There's no doubt that there were so many mistakes made, so much information was presented that turned out to be false. Colin Powell will go to his grave, for example, having regretted what he said at the United Nations when he made the case for war, because so much of what he said, so much of what I believe he believed to be true, turned out to be erroneous. But I don't know that he or other people in the U.S. government were setting out with the intention of lying. They certainly, I think, wanted to take down Saddam Hussein. They put forward a case to lead to that result, and now here we find ourselves 4 years later mired in this conflict.
Eason Jordon, in the April 11th, 2003 op-ed that you wrote in the New York Times, the news we kept to ourselves, you talk about Uday Hussein. You say that you were worried that your reporting might endanger Iraqis on our payroll and not on our payroll. I knew that CNN could not report that Saddam Hussein's eldest son, Uday, told me in 1995 that he intended to assassinate 2 of his brothers-in-law who had defected, and also the man giving them asylum, King Hussein of Jordan. What was it like to be told by Uday Hussein that he was going to kill his brothers-in-law? Where did that meeting take place?
Well, it was staggering. It took place in Baghdad at the Iraqi Olympic Committee headquarters. Uday Saddam Hussein had many roles in Iraq during his father's time, and one of them was he was the head of the Iraqi Olympic Committee, and I met him there not once but twice. On one occasion, it was just a few weeks after his brothers-in-law and his 2 sisters had defected to Jordan, and the brothers-in-law and sisters, had been given asylum by King Hussein at that time. When I met with Uday, first of all, when you meet with someone that evil, you just feel it. You feel the aura, and it's scary. The guy was an evil, evil person. I was trying to arrange an interview with Saddam Hussein. I thought that might be a path to make it happen. What ended up happening was he made these threats, saying that he wanted to kill his brothers-in-law and kill King Hussein, and I ended up reporting that directly to King Hussein just days later. But Uday Saddam Hussein was an evil, evil, evil character. I mean, I think more evil even than his father. And so it's a very, very good thing that he and his brother are dead. I mean, they were killed in Mosul a few years ago, but it was a horrifying experience in the sense that I knew if I reported that particular story, and the meeting was held on the condition that nothing about it would be reported at all ever, that I knew if I broke that rule that the interpreter, who was a CNN employee, who joined me for that meeting, he would have been killed. There's no doubt about it in my mind. The interpreter, who was a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, would have been murdered by Uday's henchmen.
Oh, was he terrified in the meeting?
Absolutely.
The interpreter, did he even want to go to this meeting?
Well, he went because I asked that he go, but he was scared because a lot of people who crossed Uday Saddam Hussein ended up dead.
Time for one more call. Bixby, Oklahoma. Go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you today?
Good
morning.
I wanted to ask Mr. Jordan a couple of things. Are you going to have any bios and name your contributors, your news contributors to your blog site? Because the American people, particularly us over in flyover country, we don't trust the news media at all. I've got personal experiences with that from family members and friends that when they're reporting on this war in Iraq, the news media is so disconnected to what the Main Street individuals think. I'll give you 2 quick examples. I'll let you go. Yesterday at that anti-war demonstration, someone was there that I knew. They called me and let me know that they talked to some officials here in Washington, and there might be 20 to 25,000 people that showed up for that event. If you open up all the major newspapers in the country, they're going to make it sound like there was 150,000. And secondly, the NBC foreign correspondent Andrea Mitchell, one time she went to Iraq, I think about three years ago. Somebody that was part of the security detail to protect her said she never came out of the hotel except to go out to the front of the street to do a couple of live reports. And I mean, she didn't want to get any sort of American perspective. She didn't want to get any sort of Iraqi perspective. And her broadcast that night was so anti-war, anti-Bush. It was unbelievable.
Thank you, caller. Eason Jordon, since we've already talked about the media, the mainstream and new media, could you tell us about the 50 or so people that you have in Iraq, and are they out in the street? What kind of work are they doing over there?
Well, they're a combination of journalists and just average people. I mean, we have housewives, we have single mothers, we have others who contribute reports. Some are just diary entries. We don't pretend that they're journalists. They're just telling us about the challenges they face in Iraq, life and death struggles in Baghdad and beyond. Then we have some real journalists, people I know, my colleagues, Robert Pelton, Neil Rosen, and others know. We do not always disclose their full names, much less a full bio, because it's so incredibly dangerous there for journalists. I mean, what I think is important for people to understand is more journalists have been killed in Iraq than have ever been killed in any war in history, at least documented. Certainly many more journalists have been killed in Iraq than in Vietnam, than in World War II, and not just journalists, but media workers, so to speak. So Iraqi journalist organizations say they've had nearly 200 Iraqi journalists and media workers killed. I know at CNN, 3 of my own colleagues, Iraqis, were killed during that time. It's very, very dangerous, and the insurgents threaten journalists on a regular basis and kill journalists on a regular basis. And so it's a very, very dangerous thing to do in Iraq, and the people who stick their necks, put their lives on the line to help report, do not always want to have their names fully disclosed or their bios disclosed. Having said that, to the extent we can get that information out there, we will certainly do it. And we, you know, as far as the gentleman's comments on Andrea Mitchell, I will say that foreign journalists are taking a lot of risk over there as well, and foreign journalists are killed in Iraq every year as well. And foreign journalists do go out and report on a regular basis. And it's not possible to go to Iraq and just go to the green zone, because you have to go to the green zone, and there is no safety. And people have been killed even in the green zone. There's this illusion, this myth that exists that the green zone is